From Lisbon, this is Frontlines and Backrooms Brief, the key stories shaping our world this week and the commentary that makes sense of them.
Welcome to Frontlines and Backrooms Brief. In a world of political flip-flops, public rhetoric and privately exchanged messages, where diplomacy has become an attempt rather than a system, and where direct and proxy wars overlap, making sense of global politics has become almost impossible. But one thing is certain: there are no more scruples in diplomacy. What for decades, even centuries, operated under the veil of diplomatic convention has simply disappeared. The difference, until recently, pressure, blackmail, threats, sanctions, and looming military interventions were reserved for smaller countries. Now the game has changed. NATO and the European Union are becoming targets of high-pressure tactics themselves. Nothing feels certain anymore. What is certain is this: the world is changing in front of us, and we are witnessing history in real time. Let's start with a new approach to diplomatic pressure: the public exposure of private messages between world leaders. President Trump publicly shared on social media a message from Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Støre, who urged him to de-escalate rhetoric around Greenland. Trump's response, also shared publicly, made one thing clear: President Trump never forgets. Dear Jonas, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 war plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. Denmark cannot protect that land from Russia or China, and why do they have a right of ownership anyway? Next came a flattering message from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Mr. President, dear Donald, what you accomplished in Syria today is incredible. I will use my media engagements in Davos to highlight your work there, in Gaza and in Ukraine. I'm committed to finding a way forward on Greenland. Can't wait to see you. Yours, Mark. Finally, a message from French President Emmanuel Macron. My friend, we are totally in line on Syria. We can do great things in Iran. I do not understand what are you doing in Greenland. Let us try to build great things. Usually, the world public would not be exposed in this way to how powerful leaders deal with countries where lives are treated as expendable, like Syria, Gaza, Ukraine, and Iran. But we are living in the age of exposure. The masks have fallen, and that, in itself, is not necessarily a bad thing. It puts pressure on those who for decades believed themselves untouchable. The most dangerous element here isn't crescents or ego. It is the demolition of diplomacy's fourth wall. For centuries, the backchannel acted as a pressure valve, a space where threats, flattery, and dirty deals could be managed without publicly torching dignity or national pride. By broadcasting private messages, President Trump has turned indignity into a political tool. He shows allies that their private appeals are public ammunition. And this performance is not just for allies. Moscow and Beijing watch, not with shock, but with calculation. They see a leader who publicly disrespects his own coalition, who frames multilateral actions as a personal favor. The message is clear: alliances are transactional, loyalty is negotiable, and Western resolve can be tested and weakened by appealing to a single leader's ego. This is also the weaponization of uncertainty. For diplomats, predictability is the bedrock of crisis management. Even an adversary's red lines, once understood, create a map. Trump's actions, turning private praises into public leverage, tying noble grievances to territorial disputes, erase that map entirely. The question for every world leader becomes: will our private outreach be used against us? And that question alone is enough to paralyze collective action. Ultimately, this behavior represents a direct strike at the legitimacy of Western-led system. The post-1945 order, for all its flaws, rested on rules, or at least on the consistent application of power by a hegemon that offered its allies a seat at the table. The danger is not that this creates new enemies, but that it steadily dismantles the cohesion, trust, and belief required to sustain the alliance that contains them. This unsettling new reality became the unspoken agenda at this year's Davos Forum, where allied leaders, sensing the erosion of the old playbook, reacted with unusual public bluntness. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
Even harsher was Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever, warning that the European Union, instead of becoming a happy vessel, risks becoming a miserable slave of the United States.
And I think Europe is at a crossroads where it has to decide. Until now, we tried to appease the new president in the White House. We were very lenient, also with the tariffs. We were lenient, hoping to get his support for the Ukraine war. We are in a very bad position at the moment. We're dependent on the United States, so we chose to be lenient. But now so many red lines are being crossed that you have the choice between your self-respect. Being a happy vassal is one thing, being a miserable slave is something else. If you back down now, you're going to lose your dignity. And that's probably the most precious thing you can have in a democracy. It's your dignity.
President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced a new European Arctic strategy, one that explicitly rejects any change to Greenland's sovereignty.
Full solidarity with Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark. The sovereignty and integrity of their territory is non-negotiable. Finally, I believe Europe needs to adjust to a new security architecture and realities that we are now facing. And this is why Europe is preparing its own security strategy, which we plan to publish later this year. And as part of this, we are upgrading our Arctic strategy too. And at the heart of this will be the fundamental principle: it is for sovereign people to decide their own future.
French President Emmanuel Macron underlined the importance of multilateralism and keeping alive international institutions.
It's as well a shift towards a world without rules, where international law is trampled underfoot, and where the only law that seems to matter is that of the strongest, and imperial ambitions are resurfacing. Obviously, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, which will enter into its fourth year next month, and conflicts continue in the Middle East and across Africa. This is as well a shift towards a world without effective collective governance, and where multilateralism is weakened by powers that obstruct it or turn away from it, and rules are undermined.
Then President Trump arrived, promising worry allies that he would not use military force to obtain Greenland, while still insisting it should become American, spilling critiques on Europe and NATO.
Certain places in Europe are not even recognizable, frankly, anymore. They're not recognizable. And we can argue about it, but there's no argument. Friends come back from different places. I don't want to insult anybody and say I don't recognize it. And that's not in a positive way. That's in a very negative way.
It's the United States alone that can protect this giant mass of land, this giant piece of ice, develop it and improve it and make it so that it's good for Europe and safe for Europe and good for us.
The problem with NATO is that we'll be there for them 100%. But I'm not sure that they'd be there for us. If we
gave them the call, gentlemen, we are being attacked. We're under attack by such and such a nation. I know them all very well. I'm not sure that they'd be there. I know we'd be there for them. I don't know that they'd be there for us.
Everything you heard is actually a CAT scan where we are today, on the brink of the end of the world that we know. That world is not going to disappear tomorrow, but ruptures are big. Troubling fact is that we don't know what comes next. As Italian Marxist philosopher and political theorist Antonio Gramsci wrote in his prison notebooks, the old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of the monsters. Gramsci was talking about the rise of fascism and Nazism in the 20s and 30s as the liberal order collapsed. But without doubt it can be used in present days. Europe and the rest of the Western nations obviously will not be quite complicit in everything what United States is doing, not because they suddenly reach high moral grounds, but because their own existence is in stake. While President Trump is in the White House, world will depend on his mood, wishes, projections, more than on the clear strategy. World needs realignment. World needs more justice. The global south and small countries are thirsty for a more just world. Without world powers, this is not going to be possible. Problem for the West is that for global south and small countries, they are no longer the most appealing partner, but more and more Russia and China. Not because they are nice guys, but because they come without expectations, demands, endless conditions, and false high moral ground. Just look at China's Belt and Road Initiative. No conditions, just investments and infrastructural development. As long as you pay the credit, also Chinese, you're good. If you don't, railways, ports or highways are ours. And with that simple tactic, China already have deep footing in Africa, some European countries and even in South America. For the global south, BRICS looks more promising. Objectively, majority of world population is already in. With centuries of undermining and with a humiliating attitude towards Africa, the continent with 1.5 billion people, with young, bold and proud leaders not ready to take dictation anymore, and all the wealth that the continent has, the West perhaps forever lost that continent as well. And lastly, what happens when you decide to manage one of the biggest humanitarian disasters in recent years, not as such, but as a failing company? You've been hearing about President Trump's Board for Peace and Gaza Executive Board. It sounds like bureaucratic jargon used in companies, but potentially hides something much bigger, a direct challenge to the entire post-World War II international system. And here is a breakdown. First, the plan itself. While details are vague, the core idea is to create a board for peace, led by the United States and regional allies. It would oversee Gaza reconstruction and security. President Trump decided to coerce world leaders and their countries to join, even Israeli government, who is directly responsible for Gaza destruction. Permanent membership in board is paid $1 billion that will be redirected to Gaza reconstruction. By calling states to join and permanent and non-permanent membership, raise the question: is President Trump's board is designed to bypass the United Nations and its agencies like UNRWA, which have historically been central to aid and governance in Gaza? Trump and his advisors have long accused the United Nations of bias and inefficiency. This plan is a practical attempt to sideline United Nations, moving control to a US-dominated group. Second, this isn't just about Gaza. It's part of a broader philosophy. The Trump worldview sees global bodies like the United Nations as constraints on American power. By creating a successful rival structure for a high-profile crisis like Gaza, the goal is to prove that nations can and should handle problems outside the United Nations framework. If this works, it sets a precedent. Other countries or blocs could follow, starting a slow-motion dismantling of the United Nations Authority, fragmenting global cooperation into competing power blocs. Finally and crucially, who rules Gaza? The plan talks about including local Palestinian voices in governing council. But here is the catch. The council would have no real political power. The actual authority, the money, the security decisions, the big reconstruction contracts would rest with the outside board for peace, dominated by the United States, Israel and maybe Gulf states. Locals would be assembled for legitimacy, but would essentially be administrators carrying out a plan designed elsewhere. It's governance of Gaza, but not by Gazans. Critics call it a modern form of trusteeship, where the people living there have little say over their future. So in short, Trump's Board for Peace is more than a Gaza plan. It is a bid to replace United Nations-led multilateralism with United States-led coalitions, and the model where outsiders hold the real power, leaving locals with a seat at the table but no control over the menu. So, where is the world order that we knew since the end of the World War II? For sure, near its end. In football terms, we are in overtime after the second half. Who will be the winners and losers? It is not clear yet. But if collective West wants to win this game in the last seconds, it will need quick consolidation, swift and hard decisions, reimagining their role in the world, and above all, reflection on all mistakes that they made in the last 81 years. And that's the world this week. From the front lines and backrooms, I'm Vladimir Bobetic, and until next time, keep looking beyond the noise.